Part 10. Radio, Records, and Urban Popular Music. The composer sits quietly. A melody written in careful ink rests upon the page. For generations, music had lived in moments like this. A performer, an audience, a single place in time. But the 20th century would change something fundamental. Music would begin to travel. At the turn of the century, a new machine appeared in homes and cafés. The phonograph, a curious device with a spinning disc and a small metal needle. For the first time, sound itself could be captured, not just remembered, not just performed again, but stored. Imagine the experience. A family gathered in a small room, a record placed gently onto the turntable, the needle lowered, and suddenly, music fills the air. A singer's voice, recorded perhaps months earlier, now present in the room. Distance disappears. Time bends slightly. For many listeners, this felt almost magical. Records changed more than convenience. They changed how music was shared. Before recordings, music belonged to the place it was performed. After recordings, music could travel far beyond the concert hall. A song recorded in Tokyo might be heard days later in a distant town. At the same time, cities were growing. Tokyo and Osaka expanded rapidly, their streets illuminated by new electric lights. Cafés, theaters, and dance halls began to appear. Urban life created new rhythms, faster, more crowded, more connected. Music began to reflect this new pace. Another invention soon followed: radio, invisible waves, carrying sound through the air. No physical record required, no performer present, only a voice moving across the nation at the speed of light. In the 1920s, radio broadcasting began in Japan. Programs included news, education, and of course, music. Families gathered around wooden receivers as warm vacuum tubes glowed softly inside. From that single box, orchestras played, singers performed, announcers spoke gently into microphones. Radio changed listening habits. Music was no longer something one sought out in a concert hall. It simply arrived into homes, into shops, into quiet evening rooms. And because millions listened at once, a shared musical culture began to form. Out of this new environment emerged a style known as ryukoka, literally popular song. These songs blended influences from many directions: Western harmony, Japanese melodic sensibility, urban emotion. They spoke of love, longing, modern life, and the quiet loneliness sometimes found in crowded cities. Early recording stars became recognizable voices across the country. People who had never met them still knew their songs, still hummed their melodies. For the first time, music created a kind of national conversation. Yet, the sound itself remained uniquely Japanese. Western instruments were present: violins, pianos, trumpets. But the phrasing often retained a certain restraint, a lingering note, a subtle shift in tone. Echoes of traditional aesthetics still lived within these modern songs. Technology had expanded the reach of music, but culture continued to shape its voice. In cafés, young listeners gathered around record players. In homes, families listened quietly to evening broadcasts. Some music encouraged dancing. Other songs invited reflection. And slowly, the idea of the music industry began to take shape. Composers wrote songs, not only for concerts, but for recordings. Singers developed distinctive styles. Producers considered what audiences wanted to hear. Music was no longer only an art. It was also becoming a profession, a business. But history rarely moves in a straight line. As the 1930s progressed, political tensions grew across the world. War would soon reshape daily life in Japan, including its music. Some songs were used to inspire unity. Others faded quietly from public life. The atmosphere of popular music changed. Still, the technologies remained. Records, radio, the ability for sound to travel. When the war finally ended, Japan entered a new era of rebuilding. Cities scarred by conflict began slowly to recover, and music, once again, played a role in that recovery. New sounds would soon arrive, new rhythms, new influences from abroad. But the foundations had already been laid. Recording technology, broadcast networks, urban audiences, all of these had transformed music from a local performance into a shared national experience. Picture a quiet night in Tokyo. A radio glows softly on a wooden table. Outside, the city hums gently. Inside, a singer's voice floats through the room. Clear, steady, carried through invisible waves. No stage, no orchestra hall, just a voice moving through the night air. From this moment forward, music would rarely remain in one place. It would travel farther, faster, and reach more listeners than ever before. And in the next chapter, those new sounds would help shape a society learning to stand again after great upheaval. For now, let the gentle hum of the radio fade into the quiet of evening and drift with us toward the music of a rebuilding nation. Part 11. Post-war sound and cultural rebuilding. The radio continues to glow softly in the night. For years, its warm light had carried voices, songs, and quiet companionship into homes across Japan, but the world around it had changed dramatically. Cities had fallen silent, concert halls had closed, and for a time, music itself seemed to hold its breath. When the war ended in 1945, Japan entered a period unlike any before. Buildings stood damaged. Families searched for stability. Entire neighborhoods were beginning again. In moments like these, people often return to the simplest forms of comfort: conversation, food, and music. At first, the sounds that filled the air were quiet ones, simple melodies sung at home, songs remembered from earlier years, music that required no stage, no orchestra, only a human voice. In those fragile months, music became less about performance and more about healing. But history moves forward, even when recovery is slow. As cities were rebuilt, so too were the spaces where music lived. Theaters reopened, dance halls returned, radio stations resumed their broadcasts, and gradually, new sounds began to appear. One of those sounds came from across the ocean: jazz, carried by American soldiers, by records, and by radio broadcasts. For many young listeners, the rhythms felt exciting, unexpected, alive. Jazz moved differently from traditional Japanese music. Its rhythms swung, its harmonies shifted freely. Improvisation allowed musicians to shape each performance in the moment. For a generation growing up after the war, this spontaneity held a special appeal. It felt modern, open, full of possibility. Small jazz cafés began to appear in cities, smoke drifting slowly through dim rooms, a piano in the corner, a trumpet resting beside a music stand. Listeners gathered quietly, sometimes late into the night, as musicians explored this new language of sound. Yet even here, Japanese musicians did not simply imitate. They listened carefully. They absorbed the rhythm, the harmony, the freedom, and gradually they began to blend these elements with their own musical sensibilities. Out of this mixture, a new form of popular music began to grow. Post-war karaoke, Japanese popular song. These songs often carried emotional melodies, supported by Western instruments, strings, piano, occasionally brass. But the phrasing remained distinctly Japanese, melancholy, gentle, reflective. For audiences still rebuilding their lives, these songs resonated deeply. They spoke of longing, of separation, of hope returning slowly. Music became a mirror for the emotions of an entire society. Technology also continued to evolve. Records improved, radio broadcasts expanded. Soon, television would join them. Music was no longer limited to one medium. It could appear in many forms, heard on the radio, purchased on vinyl, or performed live on broadcast programs. With each new medium, artists reached larger audiences. Singers became household names. Composers found new opportunities. Music companies began shaping the industry with increasing influence. But behind the growth of entertainment remained something deeper, a quiet, cultural rebuilding. Imagine a small apartment in Tokyo during the early 1950s. Evening settles outside the window. A record spins slowly. From its grooves, a singer's voice emerges, clear, expressive, filled with emotion. For the listener, the song is more than entertainment. It is reassurance, a reminder that life continues. In this way, music helped rebuild more than cities. It helped rebuild confidence, identity, a sense of shared experience. Through melodies carried across radio waves and through records spinning in quiet rooms, a new cultural atmosphere slowly emerged. This atmosphere would soon give birth to entirely new genres: rock, film music, television themes, and eventually the polished urban sound that would later become known as city pop. But those sounds still waited just beyond the horizon. For now, the night remains calm. A jazz trumpet echoes softly down a narrow street. A record spins gently in a living room. And somewhere, a radio announcer speaks quietly into a microphone. Japan is rebuilding. not only its buildings, but its voice. As the final notes of this era fade, a new musical landscape begins to appear, one shaped by cities, cinema, and a generation growing up in a rapidly changing world. And in the next chapter, those sounds will travel even farther, reaching audiences far beyond Japan's shores. After years of rebuilding, streets once quiet at night now glow with light. Neon signs flicker softly. Trains move through the darkness with steady rhythm. And somewhere in an apartment above the street, a record begins to play. By the late 20th century, Japan had entered a new chapter. The economy expanded, cities grew taller, technology became part of everyday life, and music, once carried by radio and vinyl, now moved through an increasingly connected world. The sound of this new era was different. Smoother, polished, urban. This was the atmosphere that would later be known as city pop. City pop did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly from the musical foundations of the post-war years. Western harmony, jazz influence, and Japanese melodic sensibility all continued to blend. But now the music reflected a different mood, the mood of the modern city. Late-night drives, ocean highways, apartment windows glowing above quiet streets. City pop often carried a feeling of distance, not sadness, but a gentle sense of reflection, the sound of someone looking out across a city skyline and thinking quietly about life. Synthesizers joined guitars and pianos. Electric bass moved smoothly beneath the melody. Drum machines added steady rhythm. Yet the emotional tone remained restrained. Even at its most polished, Japanese pop music often retained a certain softness, a certain space. At the same time, another form of music was shaping how people experienced sound. Film music. As Japanese cinema reached international audiences, composers began crafting soundtracks that carried deep emotional atmosphere, strings swelling quietly beneath a scene, a piano motif repeating gently, a melody returning at just the right moment. Music in film has a unique power. It guides emotion without speaking. It tells the audience what the silence means. Japanese composers became masters of this subtle art. Their work often balanced simplicity with profound emotional resonance. Soon, another visual medium expanded this influence even further. Animation, what began as domestic entertainment, gradually became something much larger. Stories animated with careful detail carried music that listeners would remember for years, sometimes decades. Film and animation soundtracks introduced Japanese music to audiences far beyond the country itself. Listeners who had never visited Japan found themselves moved by these melodies, not because they understood the language, but because the music itself carried emotion clearly. And as the internet slowly connected the world, these sounds traveled even farther. Records once sold only in Tokyo began appearing in distant countries. Old city pop songs found new listeners decades later. Young musicians sampled them, shared them, reimagined them. In a quiet way, Japanese music had become global, not through loud announcements, but through gradual discovery, one listener at a time, one melody at a time. Yet even as Japanese music reached outward, its roots remained visible. The sense of space, the emotional restraint, the careful balance between sound and silence. These qualities, present in temple music centuries earlier, still echoed quietly within modern recordings. This continuity is part of what makes musical history so fascinating. Styles change, technology evolves, instruments come and go, but deeper aesthetic instincts often remain. Imagine a quiet night again, a city skyline illuminated by soft neon light. Inside an apartment, someone listens through headphones, perhaps a city pop record, perhaps a film soundtrack. The music drifts gently into the room. Outside, cars move slowly along distant streets. The city hums softly, and somewhere far away, another listener hears the same melody. Across an ocean, across cultures, connected by sound. From ancient ritual songs to modern recordings shared worldwide, the story of Japanese music is not simply a story of styles. It is a story of listening, of adaptation, of quiet transformation across centuries. And though this chapter closes, the music itself continues, always evolving, always traveling, always carrying echoes of the past into the sounds of tomorrow. For now, let the city lights fade gently into the night and rest in the quiet rhythm of a story still unfolding.